SECfans.com. Week 7 is here, and we are talking about a non-SEC game. And Michigan fans who are familiar with us are used to seeing my smiling face right about now, and you don't. This is an audio-only version this week. We'll still have the stat packages and the graphics, but no smiling face from Daniel because I am traveling for work. I'm in Bangalore, India, and I don't have the bandwidth to upload huge, giant HD video files. So you get what you get. We're still committed to talking about your teams and talking about football every week, so we're going to make it happen. That's how dedicated we are. I've got Josh with me as usual, getting nerdy. So we're going to talk about Michigan and Wisconsin. And Wisconsin fans, you're probably not familiar with us this year. We haven't talked a lot about your team, but we're talking about you now because you are very relevant right about now. I want to remind y'all, if you love what we're doing, we're very objective. Even though we carry the SEC moniker in our name, we don't talk conference trash. No Big Ten hate here. Just objective, numbers-based view of your game and your team. So if you want to, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and then talk to us in the comments and let us know how we're wrong. Let us know how we're right, and we'll certainly engage you there. All right, Josh, this game has a lot of intrigue to me, honestly. I think it's unfair how we've forgotten about Michigan and we've forgotten about Wisconsin so fast this season, given that all the turmoil that's happening around the country and even inside the SEC, where we see a lot of mediocrity, a lot of teams just losing or playing close games against garbage teams. Outside of each one of these teams, outside of their one loss, they have really handled business. So is it fair to say that these two teams got unfairly forgotten because of their one loss and that they should absolutely still be discussed as contenders this far into the season?
I think that's completely fair. And, to Daniel's point, I mean, the first thing is we try to be as neutral as possible. The second thing is we don't have a dog in this fight, right? So, but we say we don't have a dog in it, but a lot of SEC fans probably go like have already written off Michigan or Wisconsin and said they lost a game. Look who they lost to. Haha, you lost to BYU. BYU's not very good. Stuff happens in football. Sometimes you lose a game you shouldn't lose, and I think there's a difference in saying that and saying that was probably an unusual result. I think Wisconsin's probably a better team than BYU. I think you can take away a lot of things from the Wisconsin BYU game, but I don't know that Wisconsin's by any means a bad team, even if maybe they're not going to make the playoff given their schedule and that loss. Conversely, I picked Michigan to beat Notre Dame, and you talked about Michigan fans maybe familiar with us. They're probably not happy with me because of some statements I made about both of us made about Shae Patterson before the year. And we were just trying to talk as guys in the SEC that had watched Shae Patterson play a lot of football. And we had talked about him a ton. And we made comments that were consistent with the same things we said about him going into last year when he was playing at Ole Miss, that he has, he has really up and down depending on how the rest of his team plays. And he kind of, at times, he can end up being a one-man show, but can kind of struggle to elevate the rest of your team. But we still thought Michigan would beat Notre Dame. We've both commented in Notre Dame videos that we've done that we both feel like Michigan probably should have beaten Notre Dame. That when Michigan lost their starting safety in that game, Notre Dame throws up a prayer that goes in the end zone into double coverage, should have been intercepted. And if the starting safety is there for Metella, right? That if he's in there for Michigan in that play, it's probably an interception. That changes the entire course of that game because it was an extremely close game. And this is where I think things get a little silly. If Michigan wins that game, let's say in overtime, there's a completely different discussion now about a 6-0 Michigan team based off the results of one play. And it's fair to a certain extent in playoff discussions. But what we're talking about and what we usually focus on is what's going to happen when you play this game against this opponent. A predictive aspect. And from a predictive aspect, I don't really care that Notre Dame won the jump play or didn't win the jump play given the circumstances. I care about how you played play to play. That's the only thing that's going to affect who wins this game, not your record. Win-loss record, not going to be a factor in whether or not you can run the ball against Wisconsin and vice versa. I mean, Wisconsin, I have a little more concerns, frankly, because of the specific issues they had against BYU. But I don't really care the fact that they had a 3-point loss in that game.
So, one of the things we talk about on this show is, like you said, we don't care about one play or one result as much as we care if we're considering you as a good or elite or playoff team, how you handle your garbage opponents. And that's been a theme for us for years because you can't glean a lot of good out of garbage opponents, but you can glean a lot of bad if you consistently struggle. Now, struggling with one here or there and then blowing everybody out is one thing, but to both of these teams' credit, I see that yes, they have a loss on their record, but they are handling business elsewhere. And I think to me, kind of to your point, I've taken more from them handling their business in all their other games, even though the opponents haven't been that great, than I have from their one loss. What do you think?
Um, I would agree with that. I think there's still some things to be seen from it, but I would agree with that in general.
So tell me this, and I think this gets into a little bit of your discussion or concern with what you saw in the BYU game. And for those of you who don't follow us, we have a computer model. Michigan fans didn't see it because we don't run it until the fourth week of the year, so we didn't have it in week one, but we have it now. So we're going to show you the model here in a second, and I think some of these numbers that we're about to talk about sort of lead right into the model. So feel free, Josh, if you want to bring up the model after this question, let me know. Michigan right now has the fifth best run defense in the country. And by fifth best, we do yards per play, not total yards. So they allow 2.6 yards per carry. Granted, they haven't played the best opponents in the country, but that's very good. And if we look at BYU, they're 82nd in the country at 4.48 yards per carry. And BYU was still able to beat a team that lives and dies with the run game. So, does that scare you at all if you're a Wisconsin fan going into this game, specifically in the matchup against the run defense?
I think it should. Now, this is sort of the caveat I would give with this. I think um, a lot of what we've seen from Wisconsin is really the offense was about what I expected it to be. I don't know that the offense is quite as good. You know, they had injuries and suspensions and some other things going on and off. But you know they've been without at times. You know, you have a hard time being consistently good on offense when the guys that probably should have been your two leading receivers aren't playing in all your games. But I think by and large the offense has been pretty consistent with what we expected. They've been consistent with their performance last year. The problem has been the defense hasn't been good enough to keep pace. So I am concerned really twofold with the BYU game, and I'll touch on this game specifically in the statistics. So Tanner Mangum was 12 of 22 for 89 yards in that game. He failed to throw for 100 yards. He was at 4 yards per attempt. The only touchdown pass they threw in the game was a trick play, which is kind of its own thing. But it first off, note that it took a trick play for BYU to beat Wisconsin by 3 points. So there was a little bit. We talk a lot when you score less than 24 points in the game, weird stuff happens.
And Mangum wasn't the one who threw it, by the way.
Right. Yeah. If you're scoring under 24 points a game, we talk about this a lot. You can lose despite being the better team because two plays can break the whole game. One trick play can lose you the game, even though you dominate for the rest of it. The problem with the BYU Wisconsin game is BYU rushed for 6.8 yards per carry. Wisconsin rushed for 4.7. Hornibrook pretty consistently has been a guy that is really good on third downs, but he's not maybe consistent enough, in my view, to sustain the offense by himself, passing, maybe 2 out of 3 plays. He needs to be a complementary passer in this offense. And he has the tools and skill set to be able to get you a third down. But the problem with the consistency issue is if you pass for 7 yards per play, you can convert a 3rd and 7. But let's say you're a 50% passer and you pass for 7 yards per play. And you somehow you manage to do this consistently, 7 yards per completion, we'll say. If it's 3rd and 7, you have a 50% shot of whether or not you get 7 yards. The problem is if it's 1st and 10 and you throw 3 passes, you got a 50% shot that both passes will be incompletions, or a little less than that. But comes down to like so you have this tendency that pass plays are too frequently a lost play, or that they don't gain you much yards. And then you end up in another third, then you end up in 3rd and 10 or that kind of situation. That's where Wisconsin is as an offense. Again, though, I don't fault it too much because that's what Wisconsin was last year. But yeah, no. To your circling around to your point, Wisconsin should be concerned because they're not going to be able to run the ball very successfully off on Michigan, who's going into last week was number 4 in S&P. S&P numbers don't generate again. We use them a lot because they're good 1 through 130 ranking. That's a little granular, but they're not going to run the ball overly successfully, which means they need to pass it. I haven't seen from Hornibrook that if he needs to carry the team, he's consistent enough to move the offense. The problem with all this is always relative to your situation and your opponent. Wisconsin's going to be able to move the ball and score some points, but their defense is struggling a lot more than anticipated. The BYU game showed that on the ground. And even if they're able to score 15 to 20 points, it's not going to matter if Michigan can score 30 or 40.
And you say there's a couple of things that I want to clarify for Wisconsin fans here who are going to say, hey, wait a minute. Jonathan Taylor ran for 117 yards against BYU. But again, we don't necessarily care about total yards because sometimes that's a function of how many plays you run and not necessarily a function of how productive you are. He had 4.5 yards per carry, which is what BYU gives up on average against an average. That's their number, 4.48. So that's their average opponent's running back's game. He should have been in the 7-yard per carry area. And just to illustrate, the only other game he's had below 7.7 yards per carry was against Iowa's defense at Kinnick, which is a much tougher task. So that's why we're a little bit concerned with the BYU game. Also, from a point standpoint, no, Wisconsin, you aren't giving up a ton of points, but your bread and butter has been, okay, we might need to win this game 17-10 against this good team. So giving up 24 to Nebraska, giving up 17 to Iowa, 24 to BYU, that's not great because against BYU, if you have that struggle bus day and you score 21 points, you still should have won by 10 points. So that's what we're saying. We're kind of overly critical a lot of times because we're finding the ways where you can be beat, and we compare you, we look at you as an elite team. So this is where you're going to struggle against other elite teams, and that's what we're saying. So I don't want you to freak out when we say you don't have. We're not saying you have a bad defense. We're just saying relative to what you need because of how your offense has performed. Okay, Michigan. Tell me, Josh, is the flip side of this is I've been a little bit, and Michigan fans are going to kill me for saying this, but I've been disappointed with Higdon this year. And I don't know if it's because they got Shae Patterson in and they wanted to have this, you got the quarterback whisperer head coach, and we want to have this throw first offense, which they're still running the ball a good bit, but everybody's been really high on Higdon kind of his whole career, and I haven't seen it this year, and I don't see him getting untracked against Wisconsin, even though they have had some struggles in the run game. Am I fair for picking at him just a little bit?
It's hard to argue with it to a certain extent. Higdon's numbers in the year, 580 yards, 5.7 yards per carry, they're all in theory pretty good. The problem is when you start breaking it down and who we got those yards against and who we didn't. He had 12 yards per carry against Western Michigan. He had 11 yards per carry against Nebraska. The other games, he's averaging under 4 yards per carry. He only had 3.4 against Notre Dame, 3.8 against Northwestern, 4.1 against Maryland, who's just generally kind of a bad team. So aside from the Texas game, which I don't think any of us are ever going to figure that one out, but Higdon, his good production has come against bad teams, and when they've needed him or when Michigan's needed him to produce, he has not produced at a very high level at all. It's a concern. It's a disappointment. I expected their offensive line is not fantastic. Let's be honest. Their offensive line isn't great. It's causing issues in the run game against better teams that can get disruption. But yeah, I do think it's a problem. And I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were higher in general on Chris Evans, weren't you?
I
Than
was.
Higdon
Coming out of last year, I was higher on Evans than I was on Higdon.
And I don't know if that's totally based on, backed up by statistics, but, it doesn't really matter because we haven't been able to see him carry the ball in a few games. Michigan's offense under Harbaugh is a run first offense. And when you don't have the offensive line to run the ball, it causes you to throw the ball as much as they're doing with Shae Patterson, which maybe gets around to the final side point before we get into the actual prediction, I think. And that's that Shae Patterson is doing really well for Michigan for the most part, but it's probably unrealistic to expect Shae Patterson to carry this team given carry this team at a very, let's say, elite, like top 5 level, given their issues. Good enough to beat most teams, but it kind of puts a cap on their production because they don't have a run game and they're relying too much on Patterson to sort of do everything for them.
All right, so since we've talked so much around these numbers and some of it's in theory, let's get into the model. Tell us what the model says about this team, and let's see if we can do it real quick.
Right. So the first thing we generate is a neutral statistic, which is percent of opponent averages allowed. And when we say that, it's if your opponent averages 5 yards per carry, all your opponents on overall average 5 yards per carry, and you allow 4, you allow 80% of their averages. It's just a straight neutral opponent adjusted number. And the first thing that jumps out at you far and away is where Wisconsin at is not good, and that Michigan is very good. Wisconsin, you talked about Wisconsin not having a bad defense. I'm going to risk drawing a little ire, and again, I have no dog in this fight. Wisconsin is probably a bad defense. Their rush defensive numbers, they're allowing 113% of opponent averages against the run, 105% of opponent averages against the pass. If you're below 100% of opponent averages against the run, you are a bad run defense. And 4.4 yards per carry allowed is not bad, but their opponents average under 4. So they've played poor opponents and still are giving up a pretty solid rushing average. And the passing average is better, but still a little higher. Michigan, on the other hand, 63% of opponent rushing averages, 73% of opponent passing averages. Those numbers are straight elite. I usually peg rushing average. It's a lot easier to stop the run than the pass. Anything below 65% against the run, 75% against the pass, I peg as elite. They beat both those numbers. This is one of the best defenses in college football at Michigan this year. And that kind of drives everything else. The offenses are actually pretty evenly matched in statistical performance. Actually, Michigan's a lot more balanced than Wisconsin, who's very run heavy, but about 2-1. It's about as much as you ever see in college football. Usually, even a run heavy team is 60-40, but Wisconsin's more like 70, about 65-35, almost 70-30. But Michigan is expected, because of where the defenses are at, Michigan's expected to get over 7 yards per play. Wisconsin only 4. We have a scoring model that trains itself based off what your own team has needed to be successful and how successful they were when those things happened. Based off that and plotting against your own history, it expects Michigan to score 40 points and Wisconsin to score 13. So I think this game is going to be expected to be a pretty close game. I think because of the names of the teams involved, it's expected to be low scoring. But what our model is screaming is that Wisconsin has a lot of issues on defense, and that their offense, which is still pretty good, as you said, they were able to win games with 24 to 30 points because they consistently stopped you defensively. It's saying their run defense isn't anything resembling what it was the past few years. And it thinks this is a Michigan blowout where Wisconsin just absolutely can't stop Michigan from being able to run the ball or pass the ball in this game.
All right, so I'm going to offer you not necessarily a disagreement with you or the model, but just a question for you to ponder, and you can let me know what you think. So you talked, for y'all who don't follow, having pass and rush defense over 100% for a team that's ranked is bizarre. That usually spells not just bad defense, but dumpster fire defense. So the question I have is, this has either got to be one of two things. Either Wisconsin yields a lot of yardage in a yards per play sense, which is worse than yielding a lot of total yardage, yields a lot of yardage, yields a lot of drives, but has elite red zone defense, which will far outweigh having maybe a poor overall defense. Or they're playing opponents who are too bad to capitalize on that yardage. Which one do you think it is and why?
I think it's probably the latter, and it's just looking at the schedule.
I gave you a chance. Wisconsin fans are never gonna subscribe. They're gonna hate you.
Yeah, I think I think to a certain degree, Wisconsin is dealing with teams that struggle to score, but in the red zone and take advantage. But I'm going to give you the caveat with that. And we talk about this a lot. When you play opponents that are really not very good, it's hard to differentiate yourself defensively, right? If you're playing teams that just can't run the ball, they're going to try certain things to run it to be successful. They're going to play out of character, and you can't ever look good in any game because if the team only averages, for example, Western Kentucky only averaged 3.6 yards per carry. Three of their opponents, Western Kentucky, BYU, and Iowa, all averaged 3.6 yards per carry. You're pretty much either going to slightly beat that average or you're going to look worse than that. It's hard to do a lot better than 3.5 yards per carry against anybody. Apparently, unless you're Michigan, who holds teams to 2.6. But I'm
And what
I'm
he's saying
being
here, y'all,
realistic.
is when you play poor opponents, it actually hurts your defensive numbers in terms of overall national rankings and modeling because as you approach zero, it becomes harder and harder and harder for even a good defense to show great numbers.
Right. If a team averages 1 yard per carry, it's hard to do a heck of a lot better than that. And if a team comes in averaging 7 yards per carry against weak teams, you can look phenomenal because you hold them to 4. And that's to a certain extent, Wisconsin has that problem. But I'm sorry. I'm just going to be real and objective. It's what we do on the show. I don't have any love of Michigan versus Wisconsin, but just looking at the data, they're unfortunately, and I have a friend, a coworker that's a huge Wisconsin fan, and he talks to me about the game all the time. And I don't know if he's going to listen to this,
Well, you
but shout
had a
out to
friend
the
and coworker. Now you just have a coworker.
yeah, my also named Josh, oddly enough. But it's just concerning. And if you go back and look at it too, and I wanted to say a positive, right? I wanted to give Wisconsin an out. But if you go back and look at some of the games, like Nebraska, Nebraska scored 14 points in the third quarter. And they didn't score all their points in the fourth quarter.
Right.
And if you go back and you look at, like, I don't know, let's say New Mexico, New Mexico scored at the start of the game, the end of the game. And a lot of this is going to be driven by the fact that they were in some big blowouts against bad teams. But, they also didn't completely blow out anybody in the last 3 games. It's hard for me to pin anything and not be dishonest to say why Wisconsin's defense is struggling other than to say that they're struggling.
All right. Well, why don't you go one step further and tell us what you think your score is going to be?
I do think Wisconsin's defense is probably a little better than these numbers indicate, but I don't think it's a ton. And I also think Michigan's defense is good to a level that they are being seriously underestimated as a football team right now at Michigan, based off one loss to a very good Notre Dame team. I think Michigan wins this game. I think they win it handily. I'm going to say 31-10 Michigan over Wisconsin. And not to try to make anybody feel good, because clearly I didn't do that with Wisconsin fans, but I think people are seriously underestimating how much Michigan may be a player at the end of the season to beat Penn State and or Ohio State because of how good their defense is. And for whatever reason, people are really just overestimating a 7-point loss to a quite possible playoff team in Notre Dame to start the year.
I will give a little bit of a pushback there, though, because that was the team that played within one score of Ball State and Vanderbilt and then got Dexter Williams back and got Ian Book back. But I will also say Notre Dame had all offseason to prepare for Michigan. So there's a lot of variables there, and I agree because I do think Notre Dame still has a good defense. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. I think Wisconsin's defense is better than you are giving them the credit for, and I also think that Michigan's run game isn't great right now and not good enough to take advantage of maybe some issues in the run defense game for Wisconsin. Give me 27-20 Michigan, and I think the line hasn't come out yet. I think that still both of us got Michigan covering. I just think that I think 27-20, and I think one of those scores for Wisconsin comes from a super short field or a turnover. I think I said something similar in the Michigan-Notre Dame game. 27-20, and what do you think?
I think it's pretty reasonable and realistic, and I think I'll give one parting thought. We had that video on Shae Patterson. You can go look it up. We were critical at the time with Michigan. We took a lot of heat from that. We just didn't think Shae Patterson was a Heisman contender, which he had been promoted to be at the beginning of the year. We both think he's a very talented player and a very good player. It's always everything in this game and our prediction and everything else is always relative to expectations. And how, there's a difference with how critical we are with a top 10 team or a ranked team, which both these teams are in top 15 level. So we're pretty critical. And a team that's just trying to be ranked. And I mentioned Shae Patterson because one of my curiosities is his numbers, just like we thought, go way up and way down with the quality of the opponent. And I'll be curious in this game again because just like Wisconsin, Michigan hasn't faced overly good competition. How much Shae Patterson is affected by playing what is still a better team than they've played in a few weeks. Certainly better than Maryland, Nebraska, Southern Methodist, Northwestern. They're not good teams. And is he going to elevate his play, or is he going to be the same kind of inconsistent guy we saw at Ole Miss that generated some negative plays and turnovers? I think that's going to be a major factor in this game.
I think Northwestern's defense is better than you're giving them credit for, but in general, I agree. We also said that Shae Patterson would get progressively better by the end of the year. He would be really good or more comfortable in this offense, but probably needed another year to be the pure gunslinging leader to make that offense operate. All right, y'all, that's it for this game. I hate to say it, Wisconsin fans, because like we said, we don't have a dog in the fight, and we'd love to one of us pick one and one of us pick the other, maybe to chase some views and some subscribers. But we call it like we see it, and sometimes it ends up pissing people off. But we actually still have a lot of respect for your program, have for a few years now. So anyway, please let us know in the comments what you think this game's going to look at. Wisconsin fans, tell us how we are wrong. We're happy to engage with you in comments. Just back it up with data. Make sure y'all subscribe. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.